Yeah, I just a few words about the charter here, simply because, well, it gives you the background of what we have already done, and also because I think and I hope that it will help us in driving this discussion instead of going into all kinds of different things. So I think that the really essential part of the charter are these 6 bullet items here, which categorize the various things that we think this working group can tackle. And you will see that there are certain things which are not there. The abstract data model, as we say somewhere there, oh, it's there, that we base the work on the open annotation work. Frederick said in his presentation that he wants to fast track it. We did not put it as a fast track. We will have to see, and well, that's something that we can discuss. The vocabulary is actually coming from the abstract data model. It's very related to it. What are really the terms that we want to use? Anna used already the term body and the source, for example, and some other people did not really understand what she meant. So there is a vocabulary there which is tightly related to the model that we have to specify. The annotations themselves have to be serialized. Now, for those of you who understand RDF and these things, you might say this is no big deal because the open annotation can be mapped onto RDF and RDF has its serialization. Things are not that simple because there are quite a lot of people who have anti-RDF bugs in them. And to be more serious, it is indeed true that may be very complicated. So we may want to explore alternatives which map to the same model, adding to the HTML in terms of microdata, in terms of new elements, whatever, I don't know, but something that provides a different type of expression. Also, the annotations have to be stored. We discussed that somehow, so there has to be some ideas about what serialization we can use. RESTful APIs, that's mainly for the distribution of things. Well, Greg has already touched upon that with Hydra, but there might be other things to explore, and we need some sort of an API for that. Robust link anchoring, this is the easiest thing. So this can be solved in 2 days, and that's easy. But nevertheless, I think we have to standardize this. And the client-side API in terms of, well, I mean, officially I should say the Web IDL API, which means 99% of people will use it from JavaScript anyway, but that has to be specified because we want to give a portable layer on that level. What we do not have on this, for example, is anything which is related to user interface. It is absolutely super important, but this is not something that should be or could be standardized at W3C. The only way, and that's a very important way, that this comes into the charter is that mainly the last one, the client-side API, but others as well, have to be driven by the requirements of building sexy user interfaces. If we define the foundation and this cannot be built, then we blew it. That's essentially the main items here. The way we envisage the organization of the working group, but that becomes a little bit of a detail maybe, but just to have some words here, that we essentially define 2 task forces here because there are some issues and some of technical interest that dictate that. One that we called a data task force, which is essentially the abstract model and the vocabulary, some part of the serialization, and also related to the RESTful APIs, and the client side, which looks at the JavaScript API, Web IDL API, and also some part of the RESTful API and the whole anchoring issue. Of course, these 2 task forces are not disjoint. People can work in both of them, but there has to be some sort of a categorization. The rest, I think, are administrative details which are not really of interest for today. You can look at them later. That has to be finalized. We have to finalize things like timeline and list of deliverables and documents that we have to produce. chair, staff contacts, blah, blah. I mean, those are uninteresting for today. One more thing. These 5 items, six. These are targets for recommendations, that the W3C jargon for web standards, which doesn't mean that this is the only thing we can produce. Some of us have already discussed that having a separate document, which is not a recommendation, but a separate document in terms of user requirements, that would be a good idea because it drives whatever we have done. Although some of the user requirements can come from other places. The Digital Publishing Interest Group has just published a first draft of a document of annotation requirements, but that's really for digital publishing. So we have to have a requirement documents for the annotation world as a whole, but this is not potentially a recommendation, just a guiding document. Yes?
And one other bit here. So some of these items, whenever we standardize something, we try not to make a single-use model, right? We want to have some, for example, for robust anchoring. That's actually a problem with linking in general. It's not only for annotations. And so, if we can, we want to make generalized models, and that's why we tried to break these down into parts that we thought could be reusable among different things. And it may be that the annotations working group, if it forms, doesn't actually resolve one or more of these things, but rather drives requirements to another working group. For example, how are you going to style the things that have been annotated? Well, that's actually something for the CSS working group to address, not for the annotations working group to address. So some of the things that we will work on, or that we could take on as requirements, may actually be implemented, or may actually be executed on as requirements to other groups, and in collaboration and cooperation with other groups. And so that use case and requirements idea that Yvonne mentioned is actually pretty key to how we hope we would have a successful working group.
Yeah. Now, I think that there are, just to have this discussion, there are 2 things here. First, maybe we have to have a short discussion on that, maybe not, whether there is a large category here that is missing. So if we can have a discussion on that. Let's try to keep that relatively short, and then we can take each of these and to see whether there are specific issues, technical problems, concerns, etc., that have to be discussed here, or whether, on the level of the charter here, this is sort of okay. I mean, this is... So the first question is does these points cover the field as far as a W3C group is concerned?
And as far as the first round of standardization is concerned?
Hi. This is a comment I think Art made on the AC list.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, so the question is, do we need to be specific in the charter about platform limitations and fallback approaches, for example, over EPUB readers or other environments? Does that need to be specified for this, and how would it affect the interop and the timeline and so on? I think it bears thinking about a fallback approach.
So I am not 100% sure I understand the question, but I will still try to answer it. For me, and that's me, and many people may not agree with me, on that level, an EPUB reader is the same as a browser. So I actually do not really want to make a difference here. Actually, I'm sorry, just a small sidebar here. From our point of view and my personal point of view, this working group will be a challenge in one respect, and that's something that we have to understand. It will be the first time at W3C history when we have the, in inverted comma, traditional W3C constituency working together with the digital publishing world. Unfortunately, this has not been the case before, but here we would like to have, the EPUB, world readers, etc., publishers be around the same table as the traditional web browsers. Sidebar closed.
So, I'm not certain I understood your question either, but
how are we going to get interop to work with all these different moving parts plus possible platforms?
Okay, so is that something?
I didn't understand you speak.
So the question is, if there's all these different moving parts, how tightly coupled are they, such that if we only have one or two, will there still be interop in some area, or how are we going to get interop on all these different things? I think the basic question, the basic issue of how we get interop is by testing, right? We have a specification and we have fine-grained tests, and we try to find the right players. For example, enough of the browser vendors and enough of the ebook readers to say, yes, we will implement this. And if we don't have that, then it's questionable whether there's value in us doing anything at all on that topic. But there's other things with, like, the data model, right? And a lot of people feel that that's pretty mature. And so we could get interop on any number of these things without having every one of these things. And I think that's the key. The whole of the working group is to establish that. It's not something we can resolve.
And as much as I really like loosely coupled,
is this on? Because I hardly hear anything here.
As much as I like really loosely coupled things that happen to work together, for example, the vocabulary, the serializations, and the data model, it's going to be it's going to be effort to tease those apart to be very loosely coupled. If you don't have a vocabulary, then you don't have a way of expressing your data model, and if you don't have a serialization, then you can't transfer your vocabularies.
That's absolutely correct. And on the other hand, it is also true, and actually we already have sort of existence proof for that. The open annotation model with its vocabulary and some of the serialization can be and is already used outside the web world, which is absolutely fine. I mean, everybody's happy with that. Our goal here, because this is a World Wide Web consortium, is to concentrate on web issues. But if any of these elements, like the robust anchoring, actually the robust anchoring is another good example for something, if it's properly solved, it will be used by, let's say, the metadata community, the library community, who are not really thinking in terms of annotations, but for whom that's a very useful and important specification, which is fine. I don't see any problem with that.
So I'm going to more explicitly put forward the question that Yvonne asked, which is, looking at those things, is there something that we are missing right off the bat? He was first, and then I'll come.
So we talked about provenance and copyright, and we know that the current model can accommodate those just by adding to bodies and targets. Yeah. And I was wondering, within these 6 bullet points, for instance, giving out better guidelines on how to accommodate and copyright, would that go in the number 2? Or
actually, if I can, I think actually I don't think that's something that we necessarily need to go into in the charter. We can have that as part of our use case and requirements document early on in the formation of the group.
Yeah.
Or do you...
So it's a kind of a borderline. Yes, this is one approach. I wouldn't put here in the bullet points. Editorially, the bullet points are really things that we have to do. There are, some sort of surrounding text in the document, in the charter document, like here, giving some more details. where we might want to add some reference to the fact that the annotation model should allow addition of provenance or metadata in general metadata information. So we can add some sentences here, or we can leave it to the user interface. At this moment, I am not really sure which one is better. I would not touch these 5 bullet points, which are very specific here, what we have to do.
Okay, that's fair. And the other question is about the anchoring. So we keep talking about HTML, but there are other web standards. Like what do we do with videos and other media? And that is not clearly addressed, I think, in the document.
I think that's a fair point.
That's a fair point.
Before we go on, so we had 2 things that people that Paolo brought up as possible inclusions in the charter, and I'd like to get a sense of the room really quickly, just so I don't want to leave these things hanging. We don't need to, I don't think, unless people have really pressing comments about those specific things. Okay, are you saying that you have a pressing comment? Okay. So I'd like to get a show of happiness, Nick's brand of happiness, or you can just raise your hand if you think that we should explicitly mention provenance and licensing in the charter itself, like as basically saying we have to cover this. What's that? Well, okay, so who thinks we should explicitly mention provenance discovery in the charter? So I'm seeing about a third of the people, maybe half. Okay. So I'm going to resolve that people think, so we're going to record a bunch of resolutions. So I'm going to resolve that the group was generally agreed that provenance was an important thing to explicitly mention in the charter. So as the charter, okay, just in case you haven't seen a W3C charter before, a charter scopes what the group is basically going to deliver. I actually feel like I have to now explain a little bit, because I see there's a lot of people here who aren't W3C people. What is the goal of scoping something in a charter? And there's 2 main things, and Yvonne, correct me if I miss something or if you disagree with me, but I think there's 2 main things that a charter is useful for. By scoping something, we say, we are going to talk about in this group, and we're not going to get distracted by other things. Other things are explicitly out of scope if it doesn't help us achieve reaching the goals. And this is simply to make sure that we have progress, right? And the second thing for chartering is this will determine which companies or which W3C members, companies, organizations, are going to join a working group, because this will have licensing implications for them. They have their lawyers look at these charters and say, we don't want to get into this conversation because we're in a lawsuit with somebody else, or we have patents around here that we don't want to explore. We don't expose ourselves to the legal risk of joining this group, because when you join a group, what you're doing is saying, whatever this group produces, we are going to grant a royalty-free license for the use of this technology if we have a patent on it. So these are the 2 scoping issues, and I think that the provenance thing probably falls more into the former. We're going to talk about this, and we're not going to talk about other things, but it could have implications for the latter.
Actually, just makes things a bit stronger even with what you say. Because of all the unfortunately existing IP issues, if the working group decides that there is one more item that they want to standardize, then formally the group has to be rechartered because of IPR issues. So that's why it's important to have here everything that we want to do. It may happen that some of the things that are on the charter will not be done because of some technical issues coming up, and it won't happen. That's fine, that happens. But you cannot add to it anything, in the course of the working group, because that leads to IP issues, and that's important. We have to live with that.
So I would just appreciate a little bit more clarity, because my understanding of both and distinctly the provenance issue and the issue of legal status of annotations and annotation bodies would really be that those would be themes which would have relevance both for the data model and perhaps also for APIs, but would not necessarily stand on their own as a top-level element of the charter.
So absolutely.
So
it was a little bit misunderstandable.
To be clear, when what we're talking about is putting provenance, talking about provenance in one of the larger descriptions, not as one of the major bullet points, but saying this should be addressed.
This should be possible to be done.
Okay. I'm happy to have you guys talk, but we're only on one of the three things I wanted to talk about that addressed from Paolo. If this is specifically about the things about that issue, I'm happy to. Okay. Just otherwise, yours is okay.
And just a further clarification, just because we don't specify something, even though we do say specify provenance and licensing, doesn't mean we can't do it, assuming it falls under one of the 1 to 6 high-level bullets, right? We don't need to specify, and we're going to talk about lists of annotations because that falls under the data model. It's just that we're pulling out provenance and or whatever else as important in order to advertise the group to people to be involved or not.
Right, yes. It's an art rather than a science. And it's barely art. It's like refrigerator art. Well, what's it about?
Exactly that's the point you asked about.
Okay, so hold that because we. Okay, so just I keep you. Is this about the specific? Okay.
Actually, it's important to maybe allow people to put source information, but provenance, a legal position, like if you were doing a wine and saying this is actually legal or not, or this is from this source, and you don't want to be in that or anyone. You don't want to do that because you take on liability that you don't need. There's no value for you. So source, people could be able to put source information in there. I think one of the things you should look at for vocabulary is maybe a markup language, a structure for that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You're kind of going off the topic of provenance. I'm specifically scoping this thing to provenance. And I understand that you were going on. Yep. So, and then, I'm sorry if I'm seeming curt, but I really want to focus these discussions and get.
Doug?
Provenance? No. Okay. Write it down
Doug,
someplace.
over there.
Okay. So, only raise your hand right now if you want to talk about provenance.
On providing the licensing information, there are some countries in the world where rights can be restricted by contractual clauses, and to avoid that situation, I think it's important that when the way to implement the licensing information will be mentioned, one will keep in mind that in this country under fair use or in Europe under exceptions, much of the rights of use of annotation, of many annotations, but not all, are already granted without licenses.
Sorry, just one sec. That is going deeper. That's a deeper level than we're talking about. Right now, we're just talking about what things we're talking about. And I want to really focus on that aspect.
Philip, and to be absolutely clear, what we propose here in the Charter is only to add a sentence in something like the annotation model should make it possible to add provenance and copyright information. Full stop. That's all we would do, nothing more than that. Because this working group will not go beyond that point. So that's all we are talking about.
I completely agree. Just a comment, maybe not write it specifically that the data model has to be, because maybe the API level also has to do it and so on.
Okay, you are right, but yes.
So that's I think Ivan gave a really great example. This may seem boring to you at this point, but this has a lot of implications for what we're going to do or what we could do. So let's keep the discussions not about the deeper discussions which are going to happen over the next year, right? Let's keep the discussions focused specifically on should this thing be in the charter, should it not be in the charter.
So are there any bullet points here that are missing?
So actually, sorry, we're not there yet. There were three things from Paolo.
Oh.
One was provenance, and Frederick asked that we split out licensing from provenance. Should we also talk about licensing in the same way in the charter? So can we get a show of happiness? So I'm only seeing a few people. Who thinks that we should not put licensing in scope? Okay, so overwhelmingly, people are either neutral or. So I'm going to say that that's the charter might, or the charter may, the charter may talk about licensing as well as provenance.
Okay.
And we were just trying to get broad ideas here, and we're going to craft the charter.
I think that pertinent to Yvonne's characterization of provenance, that the data model should allow the expression of licensing information would be as far as we would need to go.
Okay. And then, Paolo, you had... Yes.
Oh, yes.
And
yes.
So I think this is a no-brainer, but here we say robust linking, anchoring, and we talk specifically only about HTML5 DOM. There are other types of data. I think we do want to tackle the HTML5 one. I could be wrong about that one. We'll address that. But there are images, there's data, there's
web
media,
content.
Any other thing.
Yeah.
So do people generally agree with... Oh, sorry, Nick, you have something...
So thank you, Ivan, for clarifying that if something is not in the charter, we cannot specify it without rechartering. That's probably not a verb, but anyway.
It is a jargon at W3C.
That is useful, but with that in mind, I wonder... I mean, you've specifically asked the question, is there anything that's missing? And if you don't want to go into any discussion of maybe we shouldn't be discussing certain things because they're great big rabbit's nests that we don't want to go down, then that's fine. But I just wonder whether the link anchoring thing specifically talks about an algorithm defining a set of heuristics rather than the process of putting multiple anchors in the data model and retrieving them. And I wonder whether having those algorithms specified is a very, very deep hole, specifically when you get onto multiple different media types and the fact that, frankly, nobody anywhere in the world knows what the best algorithms for doing those things are over any single content type. So trying to specify that might be extremely difficult and burn huge amounts of cycles. Anyway,
So I'm going to interpret that in a slightly different way. We want to go through each of these and talk about them in depth, and that, well, as in depth as we have time for. That's a consideration. What I'm specifically asking is, if we're going to do robust linking, should we also include other media types? So that's the question before the group at the moment.
Can we circumscribe the other media types in some fashion? I mean, there are different number of media types.
Sure.
And we want to focus on ones that are relevant to it.
I think that's a great distinction. So some of the ones that have been mentioned here are maps, which is a pretty common case, but that could be done. Yvonne said something earlier, which was that whatever linking mechanism we have, it should be extensible.
Yeah.
So we want to talk about what we think we can accomplish in a year or 2 years of work. We aren't going to be able to do everything, we should probably have an extensible. So I think that probably. Okay, so I'm going to ask you for a show of hands because I think that this addresses Paolo's case. Do you, assuming that we have something about robust anchoring, do we agree that that the charter should say that there should be an extensible mechanism so that other types of media can be linked to? Okay, so that's a yes.
Yes.
So the resolution is if we do have robust anchoring in the charter, it should be extensible so that other anchoring mechanisms can for different data media types can be specified.
Right.
Frederick, I saw you have. Just a second. Well, it's just
I wouldn't want the data model, obviously, to lose the ability to annotate things like maps, etc. And obviously, we don't need to say that in a charter, do we? In other words, we're making it extensible. We want to make sure the data model is robust and remains robust. We don't need to spell that out, even though we're using extensibility points for the other aspects.
Let me give you an example of why it's probably important for us to talk about this. If somebody has a patent specifically on linking to a map, right? They're going to want to know if that's in scope for the group before. So are we only specifying that it should be, that some extension should be possible, or are we also going to work on map stuff? And that's sort of the question at hand.
Right. Are we already at the point where we go into the details? Because we are beginning to get into the details of one of these. Have we, I'm sorry, Tim. Have we closed the first question or not?
I have a question.
Okay, so I'm sorry, Tim, but let's.
So is in the 6th point the question included how we trigger the injection of the annotations? I mean, that what Nick was talking about. I mean, bookmarklet is not.
Sorry, we're not talking about that at the moment.
It's not part of the charter.
But we're not talking about that particular issue yet. We're not, sorry, we haven't finished the question of are there other things, or have you gone back to the issue of
what?
It was up to 6 points.
I mean,
sorry.
The question is whether there is one element missing.
Okay, and
he seems to say.
Okay, so if you have a question about something that's missing, there are other people before you that also had that same question. We hadn't yet gotten to that point. I was just trying. Right, we're not quite there yet. Sorry. Just to be clear, I'm going to be putting questions we're going to be putting questions to the audience, and we want you guys, and then we will explicitly open up the other issues.
So I'm talking as co-chair of the community group as well for this, and what we're thinking, and this is also a recommendation that comes from Herbert van de Sompel. We were thinking about all these different use cases that have precise communities that work on those use cases. So if we keep here in the charter the extensible wording in there, we might be able even to use the community group as an incubator for all these different aspects that might take forever to get to, right?
Yes.
So maybe that could be a good way of organizing.
Absolutely, but that's outside the scope of the charter discussion. Yeah. Okay.
I think there is one.
So, can we answer the question about what is potentially missing?
Okay, so hold that question because I just want to make sure that we're finished with the current round of discussion.
So,
does anybody else have anything about the points that we specifically called out as resolutions for Paolo's particular things? Okay, so now if you have an additional thing that's missing from the charter, now please raise your hand.
And we'll go back there.
Yeah, of the main items there. Okay, so I think I see some confused faces.
He was up for a long time.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to. Okay. It's not going to be quick.
So I was curious about accessibility and where that falls in there. Is ARIA fall under somewhat one of those bullet points or not? And if it doesn't, why?
So we should probably mention something about accessibility. We probably didn't mention it because it's implicit in anything W3C does.
Okay,
Everything that W3C does, we try to find the accessible, and we actually, in our requirements, we do link to the accessibility. But can everybody agree that we should address issues of accessibility in the charter?
Yeah. So.
Okay. So just 1 second. I think that that's extraneous. It's not an additional bullet point of something we have to do. It's just it goes with all the other stuff.
So there is maybe one thing, again, for those who are not familiar with the W3C world, there is a separate section here which are what we call the liaisons, which means that we have formal agreement with other groups on very specific subjects, on how the other groups have a say in what this group does. They can comment, we explicitly ask them for commenting, etc. The way groups are practically a standard part of all our standards. We have to, and we want to, connect to those groups to look over our shoulders and look at these things. I'm sorry, yes. So the Web Accessibility Initiative, as we call it, they look over our shoulders. It's explicitly listed here. So the question is whether do you see anything such that it has to be added to the main body of the charter related to accessibility. Personally, I don't believe there is, but that's the question that has to be answered.
I think it's pretty easy for us to just say we'll add a mention of accessibility in there, an explicit mention of accessibility in there. It's not one of the 6 or 7 or 8 things that are a primary item that we're going to work on. It's implicit in all of them. Okay, so
he was for a long time.
I would just like to make sure privacy also gets into that as something
privacy,
by default.
Security.
Okay.
So so that's a good point. So we're going to put things about privacy, security, and accessibility. Those are what we call verticals. I can't remember. Horizontals. Yes, those are what we call horizontals, and those are. We may even mention them in.
That's also listed there, in the same way. And actually, there is also the issues. Maybe of internationalization. I mean,
right, that's the other one, right?
What happens, and okay, but
so all of those again, those are things that are sort of implicit and not specific deliverables. What we're talking about is specific. Think of it in terms. Well, unless you work on specifications, you may not know. But think of it in terms of the different specifications. Think of each of these items as sort of as a specification. It may be one or more specifications. But we're asking now, are we missing some big piece that needs its own specification?
So, Michael, I think you have them on this.
Sorry, just a second.
I was just wondering, because we are doing, in some cases, injection into foreign pages, and if that is something that should be spelled out in the charter or not. This specific problem of adding to another, it's kind of cross-page scripting, right? Is this specific or not? I don't know, it's a question.
First Nick, and then I'll get back to you in just a second. Because Nick raised this during his talk.
So, to rephrase slightly, I think the question is, we know specifying all possible user interfaces for annotating is scope, and a way we would be able to do that.
Or even any user interface at all.
Or even any user interface at all. However, it needs to be, in my view, it needs to be plausible that people can create such user interfaces in a standards-based way.
Absolutely.
And at the moment, I would posit that it's, this is a discussion we can have. It's all, I'm just raising the issue, right? I would posit at the moment that it is not, because the only mechanism that is available to people for actually building those user interfaces are browser extensions, which are vendor-specific. And I do not know. And frankly, I don't think that it is the role of this group to standardize those things. But it may very well be that if we don't have a standard way of building those components and shipping those components, then all of this work will be for naught, because there will be no traction, there will be without user interfaces, nobody will use it. So I don't know whether that means that we include that in the charter,
or whether or not you guys know of another working group who would be able to pick that piece of work up. I guess there's the desktop apps people. There's a lot of things that are close but no cigar. So I'm just raising that as an issue.
I have an opinion, but I'm going to save it until after. So I think that is a really good question, and I think that it is so broad a question. That's not about annotations. That is something for some other working group to solve. It's too big a question for us to solve. We may well push that into our use cases and requirements. Yes. Another possible outcome here is that browsers see the light and they provide that sidebar themselves, and that the annotation things or whatever user interface it is, that the browsers do that themselves. That's another possible outcome here. So I think we could certainly put that in use case requirements, but I also don't think that we know yet precisely what we would do there in the first place. So I think we need to discuss that, and maybe we would have possibly have a special task force or even a community group to talk specifically about that problem. So I would personally vote not to put it in. But just one moment.
I think that would be a good approach. Now, he's mentioned the vocabulary. You're kind of down that road a little bit. That's why I mentioned earlier markup language or an actual framework. You may want to just support that, though, and let others build that and it bubble up from either your working group or others who build that. As long as you have a bit about what you say, you accept and manage that. That's the W3C, to actually be that place to kind of put their that people can then make changes, and if they affect and spill over, to moderate that impact. I think that's maybe a better structure for you guys for time.
So I'm going to put the question to.
Can you repeat the question? I have difficulty.
It wasn't a question. It was a comment. It was a response. Basically, he was saying that he thinks it's best left to frameworks and other things, and that we might. There's a lot of other ways that people could get into it. I'm sorry, I can't characterize from memory everything he said, but it was not a question. So
okay.
And it's on the record, so we'll capture it. But I'd like to put to the group the question of, should this group's charter include a mechanism to enable extension-like capabilities to scripts as effectively as that's how I'm going to characterize it.
Can I have a comment?
I'm not sure here. Maybe we don't have to find a way to do it, but maybe we can add something smaller, like that we analyze the scope of that and like propose something. I'm not sure. Like that's
not the sort of thing that does. That's the problem. It's a whole other group. So we would. So the question is, should it be in scope to specify a mechanism whereby third-party applications can have privileged access to websites in the Web Annotation Charter? And does anybody feel that we should do that? So the question is, the way I see it is, should the Web Annotation Working Group Charter explicitly include mention of a mechanism to allow third-party applications privileged access to web pages, which is effectively what we're asking for here. In the mechanism of like extensions, for example, or whatever. Or do you think it's a mischaracterization of?
I'm not sure whether it's a mischaracterization of the question. That's probably for the questioner to say. But to me, that sounds very much like that should be a liaison with WebAppSec, right?
But that's not the question. The question is, should the charter include that explicitly? And and I'm seeing nobody thinks that it should.
Yeah.
There's a
That's sec explicitly.
okay, but that's a liaison, not a. That's okay. Let me focus for just a moment. We're explicitly asking what new deliverables we would need to put into the specification. We're not necessarily talking about liaisons. We're not talking about other things that should happen at W3C. We're talking about this particular charter. And okay.
I'm sorry, just make sure. So how do you do number 6? You don't allow that in some fashion. I mean.
Okay, so how you do number 6 is you would specify a client-side API that would be implemented in browsers, for example.
So I just to make a very small point, I appreciate the point you're making, but it might be helpful for people to understand why the answer to the question would be no, if they understood that an alternative mechanism for solving those problems would be through a liaison with another working group. That's
okay. I'm not. Yeah, it's hard for me to unpack whatever, but so that's helpful. Thank you.
This is Tom Tech. I'll attempt a +1 expansion on that, which is that while discussing what should and should not be a deliverable, one of the ways of saying no should be saying we want to delegate this to another group. And that's why we want to say no, and therefore it impacts input into the liaison section. So I don't think it's reasonable to say let's only talk about deliverables. We can't talk about liaisons. So we're saying we actually do want to talk about that as a method of delegation.
So that was actually my next question, which first I wanted to resolve the question of do we think it belongs in this charter? It's obvious that people think that this is an interesting question. The next question, so first off, the resolution on this, okay, actually can I see an up or down vote with the little twinkly things? Does anyone believe that we should be specifying this mechanism for third-party institutions? And I'm seeing some big no's. So the resolution is that we will not explicitly put in scope the idea of this third-party privileged access mechanism. Obviously, people were interested enough in the topic. Let me just, okay.
I want to clarify, if a year down the road the group decides this would be a good thing to do, it can now not do it because it's not chartered.
Correct.
The group could not do it without rechartering.
Right. Correct.
Yes, we're explicitly saying what we are going to be working on in the next year. And the group will be rechartered in 2 years anyway, and maybe 2 years from now we change our minds about that. I personally don't think that the scope of this group is such that we would be solving a case that actually addresses many, many, many use cases, not just annotation. Like, I think that this should be some other group.
So, new suggested addition. I just noticed that there's...
Wait, is this a new suggested addition? Because we haven't resolved the last thing.
Well, that's why I was raising my...
Okay, I'm sorry. Just if you have new suggested additions, please don't raise your hands yet because we're not on that yet. Thank you.
Okay. Just a word of warning. Per schedule, we have 45 minutes left.
Yeah,
so we should get to the point where we get to each individual notes here, which we haven't really done yet.
Okay, so I have a question. So we still cannot then add something like, because I understand that we cannot specify what the mechanism should be for injection, but I do think that we as an annotation group should specify as a result of our work what the requirements for annotations to work are to be able to work in the...
Respectfully, I disagree. I understand why you're saying that, but there's nothing stopping from anybody in this group from saying this is a big problem. Let's go form a W3C community group about it and discuss it over there, be informed by and inform the discussions about the annotations. I don't want to distract the group with a with a rather off-topic thing when there's plenty for this group to do. I don't want those discussions to be happening in the context of this working group because there are also legal implications to those discussions. I think that should be in a community group where the legal situation can be resolved on that particular topic. Does that make sense to people? So I'm going to suggest, in the interest of time, that we not call a separate vote and that we just say that there is a lot of interest in a privileged third-party mechanism for accessing web pages, and that we are going to investigate forming a community group, which this group can either formally or informally have a liaison with. Actually, we don't have liaisons with community groups. So basically, there's nothing stopping us from just talking about these topics with community groups or anybody else, but we are focusing this topic. I'm sorry I'm seeming like a little tyrant here, but we have a limited amount of time, and we want to pull out exactly the resolutions that we're trying to bring out.
So, are we at the point where we can go to each individual items?
I don't know yet if... Does anybody else think we're missing something major?
Tantek, was your point a missing item, or you want to comment on one of these six? Pardon me? Okay. You have one of each, one of the two.
Okay, so right now we're just talking about high-level items that are missing from the high-level deliverables that we're missing from this list.
So what about a federation and decentralization? Is this included here? Or do we want to include it?
Can you repeat? I didn't understand.
He asked whether federation and decentralization is one of the high-level items. I personally would like to see federation and decentralization mentioned in the specification, but I don't think that, because we don't have a potential spec for how we would do that. Unless we know exactly, or we have a pretty good idea about how we would decentralize something, there's no way we could put it as a deliverable, but we could have it as a consideration.
We have only 2.5 years, and that requires maybe more than that.
Oh, direct response. Okay. I think those. I have those things as primary items in my thing, but.
Oh, actually, I should wait. It's for.
Okay, then Tantek.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Actually, just.
Oh, I'm sorry.
One little item, I think maybe one little item, that may help you with this on these other pieces is if you have a means, since you're using HTML, to use local storage. So maybe the user has control, you support in principle and abstract, however you want to do that. Local storage and local user control of that, so you offload that problem from yourself. And the liability.
So I agree with that, but it's drilling down into technical details that we're not trying to solve.
Yes. But it's listed in your actual thing, client-side API, scripting, and so if API says somebody's going to be responsible for it.
Right, but let me
actually put you in the problem.
Okay. But what I'm saying is we decide those items in the discussion of the group. Right now we're just talking about the scope of the charter.
Tantek, your turn to add a bullet item if you want, or to propose one.
So I'm bringing this bullet item as a
If that's the case, if that's part of your wishes, then I would say that we need to consider going against the previous framing of saying excluding UI and to explicitly include user interface discussions, research, documentation, not specification, at least those two in the charter, so that all the folks here that talk about UI and such can do so in the working group,
documented publicly, and so provide confidence that that's an area where people feel okay contributing under W3C terms such discussions.
So, as a high-level comment, I would say I'd love to have discussions about UI. Every time we have started discussions about UI, the browser vendors go crazy and hate us forever.
They can join the working group to do that.
So I didn't say specification.
Right. So I think it could be within the scope, or we could also form a community group. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's my immediate reaction, Tantek, and we will have to discuss that. I would actually be in favor to put into the charter something which says that the group will also, produce a note on some UI ideas or whatever. It may well be that during the charter discussion, the browser vendors will say no way. It's up to them to say that during the AC vote. That's why they are AC members. But to put it explicitly not as a recommendation, and that's what you said, but as a no. Maybe.
Can it be under bullet 6 that as part of specifying the client-side API, there will be a requirements document written based on an understanding generated through the regular of the user interface requirements?
I would actually milden that. I mean, to say requirement is too strong of a word, even if it's a note. But, to document the user interface, state of the art of user interface in annotation or something like that might make sense.
Or even non-normative examples.
Say it again?
Non-normative examples.
We could certainly non-normative.
I agree with disagreeing with requirements. I agree with leaving out specifications or recommendations, as you suggested, Ivan. But I want the group to have the scope, the freedom in the scope to have those discussions, and not leave them out. That's the basic idea.
Okay, so actually, so it's not the big item.
It's not a new bullet item.
It's not a new bullet item, but
it's in the deliverables.
So who here thinks that the charter should at least try? And if we put something in the charter and our members say no, that will not fly, we can take it out again, and we can feel it out. My feeling, this is my personal feeling, I think if we mention it, we will get a strong negative reaction, because that's been our experience in the past whenever we've started talking about UI stuff. But I think it's worth a try, and it's an interesting idea. But that's just my personal opinion. Who here thinks we should mention non-normative? By non-normative, I mean not requirements, just exploration of UI. Okay, who here thinks we should not? I'm seeing roughly equal numbers of people who say should and should not. Did I miss you?
I just had a point about scope. We have a lot of work already on the page for 2 years, and I think it's really important that we stay focused on the core things that it's going to do. And I see user interface stuff as being this giant rabbit hole that we're going to fall into, and it's going to take a lot of our time. It's very important, but we need to stay focused.
I must admit that's a very good point.
And what we could talk about the color of user interfaces, and that nobody would. Everybody seems to like that idea. I'm going to make a suggestion. See if my suggestion. I see that there's some hands raised, but I'm going to make a suggestion that this is actually a really great idea for a community group, and that it's probably a better, if you are really interested in this topic, form a community group, talk about it. That can inform what a group, what a browser decides to do, just as well as a non-normative note from a working group. How do people feel about that idea?
Okay.
I see slightly favorable.
So, yeah, I really don't know on the UI question, but I think tangentially, well, not tangentially, but closely related to that, is whether or not there should be a non-normative discussion of what we talked about earlier, touched on earlier, about the sort of the high-level requirements for making UIs What am I trying to say? Making it possible for people to develop their own UIs.
I hear what you're saying. I, again, think that that is actually the province of a different group because we want to focus. As Anna said, this is a huge amount of work anyway. And nothing stops, just because you follow this group or participate in this group or whatever you do in this group, it doesn't stop you from doing other things as well, right? We're talking about the resources of this group, not your resources. If you're personally interested in doing something, do it. And we will support you as much as we can, but let's not boil the ocean on version 1.
May I propose to go into the individual group? We have only half an hour.
Yeah, okay, so I hope I realize that some of you are new to this, and I hope that we've been clear that what we're talking about is roughly 6 specifications. Roughly. And I've heard a lot of people say, hey, what about these other things? But I haven't heard anybody say, this is a whole new bullet point. You guys completely missed this thing that we should go into. And unless somebody has one of those really like specification level things that we're missing, I think we should move on to discussing the individual items.
Yeah.
So do I have? Okay, great. Thank you.
So we started, well, we added already to the charter the approach to base the abstract data model on the open annotation model. I have to emphasize the word base. It's not one-to-one taking it over and putting a stamp on it. I don't know whether this is something that we want to discuss here or whether this is just sort of agreed. Frederick?
I'm not sure where you're going with that.
Well, maybe people can say that an open data model is fine, but they want something totally different and not the OA. I mean...
Okay.
While I appreciate I'm sure that the other aspects will also bring up things in the model that we'll need to think about more carefully, and we wouldn't want to rush and go, yeah, and here's version 1.1 at the end of the thing.
Okay, so actually let me address that, because I think that's actually a key issue. I see no problem with us having a version 1 and then a version 1.1 really quickly, so long as we think that the underlying model, like if there's something that needs to drastically change, maybe we should rethink it. If it's something that, we forgot to add this thing and it's okay that we can bolt it on.
But I, personally, I wouldn't see a real value of rubber stamping something as 1.0 version with the knowledge that we would go and work again on it, because the current CG document is already out there and stable. So putting a recommendation step on something which is already out there and stable just to revise it a year or year and a half later, I don't see the reason for that.
The thing I'd be most worried about with the current model, and like Rob, obviously I think it's a good idea, is the serialization, given the desire to have HTML serialization.
Yeah.
It's not addressed anywhere in the current model.
So as somebody who's actually talked on the list about alternate serializations, and specifically an explicit HTML serialization, not an RDFA serialization, but an actual HTML serialization, I don't see, there are some things that I would change about the model, having gone through the exercise of modeling out existing annotation-like things and comment-like things. but we're not talking about rubber stamping this. We're talking about having a discussion in a working group. We're talking about saying, okay, let's quickly try to do, maybe the serialization thing is something that we consider, and then we say, okay, this is good enough, and we can always have a 1.1. And I actually disagree with you a little bit. I think that just because something is stable doesn't have the premature of a W3C specification.
Of course, that's clear, but having... come on, don't go sleep. Just having a recommendation with the knowledge that within a very short amount of time it will be redone.
Well, so I think we're going to... The point of this discussion is not, is this thing absolutely done and will we just rubber stamp it tomorrow? The point is, are we comfortable with that being an item in this model? And I think, is there anybody here who is not comfortable with that data model or that item as one of the deliverables?
Hey, man.
No. So I think that we've resolved that issue.
It's just that I lost my connection. Go on.
So with number 2. Yes. Just a second. We're trying to record this, right?
Can we add to 1 an abstract data model for annotations and collections thereof?
I don't know what that means.
The discussion that Frederick brought up earlier about collections of annotations being necessary and potentially requiring different information from the individual annotations. For example, some publisher collects all of the annotations on one of their books, publishes that collection of annotations for sale, and how does that work? Do we need to specify higher than an annotation as something that we're going to talk about? Because that seems like a deliverable to me.
I think I understand you.
Yeah, and I want to add that sets of annotations are already widely used, and the EPUB, the new EPUB document that we've been working on, and Rob is co-editor as well, is also including sets. So if we don't get there, we are going to have 25 billion solutions out there on our.
I agree that those things should be explicitly mentioned, but I also agree with Doug that there's no harm in having a rec and then a 1.1 rec so that you have a baseline.
So,
just one moment. Let me just...
I'm sorry, Anna.
I just wanted to say there are already specifications for collecting.
So my reaction on that is that on the one hand, we say that the data model is based on open annotation, but we have to look at it again. On the other hand, we say that we have to have a use case document. So that for me is a typical case that if the use case is really required that, then yes, of course, this has to be done, which is fine. I don't see why I would pull out explicitly this feature and put it into the charter, right? I mean, that's why we need the use case document, and what you just said actually is a living proof why I disagree with what Frederick said.
Guys, I sense...
But I think we go too much into the weeds.
I think we're about to lose the thread here.
Yeah.
That's the kind of feedback we don't have to decide here at this.
Yes.
This is not the final discussion.
Yeah.
Let's consider that as feedback. Randall, could you just say that we're going to consider adding sets of annotations to discussion of sets of annotations to the charter, but that we're not committing to it, and we'll readdress that because I think that's a longer discussion than we can have in the 20 minutes we have left.
So I actually don't know which of the other items, or you...
Okay, I'm going to try to shortcut this because
yes.
we're running very low on time.
apologies if I didn't get some earlier work, but to me it looks like the first three items, except of the mention for annotations or the examples, they sort of would be compulsory in any work of this type, in any domain. I mean, I don't see really that we would need to, certainly they need to be there, and I don't see how we could add much stuff without risk of over-specifying the work. While the next 3 points, for example, you know, there are two types of APIs that are mentioned. To me, the exact limit between what you want to do with a RESTful API using HTTP and with a script-based API on the client side, this is something that will need lots of exploration, because from practical experience, it's not that easy to understand what feature fits in each. And the robustly concur, but I do agree that both things should stay there. But we must be conscious that exactly their scope is yet to be explored and defined.
I'm about to change it from the first one to all points. So let me address this, and then if I haven't. So we heard, hopefully, remind me of your name, I apologize. Philippe. I think that the first three things are very closely related, and I agree with Philippe that it would be hard to have a group without considering them. And if we tried to drop one of them at some point, we decided, we don't want to do multiple serializations for whatever reason, we aren't committed to doing that, right? So I'm just gonna ask, does anybody feel like any of the first three should be dropped out of the charter? Or do you feel like they should be in scope? So if you feel they should be dropped out of the charter, raise your hand. Excellent. I just saved us an hour. So that leaves us with the RESTful API. Our friends at the IEEE and the government have some ideas about that as well, I think. You know, there's the whole activity streams and how we resolve this. Maybe we just reference something else. Maybe we develop something entirely new and magical. That's not the question on the table. The question on the table is, should it be there at all?
Frederick, 2 points. One is on the serializations. I think we should require one, for example, JSON LD, but that's the deliverable section which needs to be written, I guess. But I think that we should have something required for interoperability and adoption. And then for RESTful, I think search needs to be in this list if we're being this explicit about create, access, and manage annotations. Search should be added.
I agree.
Tell it again.
So I'll just repeat. For the serialization, he suggested that a JSON model should be one of the models required.
JSON or JSON LD?
Okay, JSON LD.
That's what he said.
Yeah, but JSON is also, as far as I'm concerned, JSON is also on the table, but that's whatever.
So
JSON LD is JSON. So
but that's already there.
So you mentioned it explicitly?
JSON? Yeah, I got that. Well,
I think that's for the chairs to really drive, and I'd rather not put a requirement in the specification or in the charter for that. But we can keep having that conversation, and that can be feedback from Nokia, for example, in the regarding we should also explicitly mention search for the RESTful API. I think that's non-controversial. If we could just have a resolution that it also includes search.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Perhaps we should leave it open for other
Sure, we'll
things.
put search and other things.
Yep.
Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, search and other things.
Doug, I thought I heard you mention activity streams explicitly. Like, should we include or not include? Was that the question?
I think it might be good for us to put a requirement. Well, I don't know. I'd rather we don't say how we're going to solve it in the charter. I'd rather we just let the group decide.
So, in as much as I can contribute to this, I would advise not specifying activity streams in the charter for two reasons. One, there's already a working group in progress that's trying to charter to work on activity streams, perhaps even in this context, the social web working group. And two, as a result of that process, we have found that there are certain organizations that are objecting strongly to mentioning activity streams. So if you want to avoid the same objections, you may wish to not mention activity streams in your charter. That's all I'm going to say on that. I'm not going to name names.
Point well taken.
Point well taken. And so since we don't mention activity streams now, I think we're safe.
So I would propose that we change number 4 from RESTful API to just mention HTTP-based API. The point is that I don't know why would we limit ourselves already to the RESTful API. For example, the RESTful API doesn't provide push capabilities, and I don't think why would we limit ourselves now already to this.
All right, that seems reasonable to me. I think we can basically say an HTTP-based API and decide later if it's RESTful or if...
I'm fine with it.
Yeah, so Randall, if you could capture, thanks. That is a resolution.
I think Randall had also a question, right?
Oh, did you?
My question was whether discovery is a separate issue from search that should be mentioned there or not.
I think we could mention discovery. We could mention... I think we can mention a bunch of verbs, and I don't think anybody's going to object to any particular verb.
But I think we also agreed that it's an open-ended in the charter.
And we can mention a number of verbs, and we can also leave it open-ended. So the client-side API, I think that a lot of work has to go there is to decide exactly what that client-side API would even be. And I'm going to come back to the robust anchoring because I think that might be the most controversial. I think that we should keep a client-side API in there because I believe that we want to give ourselves scope to work on that within the group. Does anybody object to us keeping that, even though it is not very well defined yet, what exactly that will be? Okay, I'm not seeing any objections. Now, we've already had some comments on robust linking. Also, I guess resolution, we're going to keep number 6 in, the client-side API in. Number 5, robust linking. What?
Yeah, well...
No. There's nothing, not related. Not related to WebIDL. Not necessarily related to WebIDL. It's the wrong stack. It's at the wrong stack. It's all the wrong part of the stack.
Okay.
We might... Yeah.
I trust you. All right.
Robust link anchoring. So we've already heard from Nick, for example, that we may not want to determine a specific algorithm. I personally would cry and pout like a little baby if we didn't. But that wouldn't be the first time.
Be careful, I will try that. Just to hear it. Right now I absolutely would. But I think we could amend the wording of that. How do people feel about the idea of amending that to be a little less strong about us explicitly defining an algorithm? I'm seeing some hands. Who feels like it should be left in the way it is? All right, so I think that we should have a longer conversation than we can do at this late hour in the day about exactly what the wording on number 5 is. But do we agree that we will try to address some aspects of robust anchoring? Oh yeah, well
Yes, so there's a resolution. We will try to address aspects of robust anchoring that the friendly amendment from Nick earlier, where and from Yvonne, that we explicitly make it a extensible mechanism, and that we may address some format-specific ones, and we may mention or not mention, depending on the resolution, the ongoing conversation, what those ones will be. I see.
So it's not clear that this should be deliverable at all, actually. I think robust anchoring is essential to data annotations.
Right, however, it's essential as a general platform feature that's not restricted to annotation. I think that this group could be a great source of requirements for a new platform feature to enable that. But I think we should stop short of saying that we would produce the solution for it.
All right, I'm going to modify. I think we said before, we already acknowledged that this group may not make all the deliverables that itself. I personally feel like we should come up with some solution. I feel we should at the very least be an input. I'm not certain how we could with confidence both put it in scope and say that we won't work on it.
Yeah, to be honest, from here it's very difficult to hear because everything goes well.
So what he said was that he thinks that robust anchoring is a larger issue, and I agree with this, is a larger issue than annotations. It's a basic platform feature, and he suggested that perhaps this group might not be the one to work on it, but rather that we might drive use cases and requirements towards that. That said, Ted, if I could ask, is there some other group working on it? Sorry, just a second. The closest thing would probably be the range thing that's happening on Web API, maybe?
I mean, the closest prior art that I know of is EPUB CFI. It's called EPUB CFI, IDPF, and it's EPUB specific.
That's very EPUB specific, yeah.
Right.
So I must admit that when Doug and I began to work on that a few months ago, then this was probably the most complicated one that we were referring to. The problem is that what we know is that most, not all, but most of the annotation systems need something like that. We know that. So in a sense, without this being resolved, the whole thing might be useless. I mean, put things a little bit too extreme, but the whole thing might be useless in terms of standards. So I think maybe that should be reworded in a way that by emphasizing the extensibility of that there should be a structure defined that works for the simple cases, works for the cases that we already know how to handle, allows for the addition of complex cases that we cannot manage in those years or we don't even know about. So something like that, but leaving it out from the charter altogether, for me, makes the whole work questionable. Maybe this is a little bit overspecified. That's where we may make Doug cry. I don't know. But you know, leaving it out seems to be over the top for me.
So then leave everything else out.
Say again?
If discuss if the other work relies on the success of this element, then solve this thing first, and then come back to the work. Or sort of two groups. I mean, I don't see why...
Actually, one alternative we did discuss back then, Doug and I, is to charter two groups, indeed. We thought of that. But I think we both were a bit afraid of sort of creating independent entities that would not synchronize with one another, and that would create a lot of problems. So that's why we ended up here. Robert.
Don't call it out. If we don't call it out as a separate you already have to be able to forecast things to have that.
That is correct.
As a fifth, or maybe bullet, it says this is something fundamental to the success of the project, which is what we've just been talking about. We have to have a deliverable specifically to solve this problem because it's that important. So I'm in favour of leaving it and of being less restrictive as the current text to enable solutions like the hypothesis folks are working on, like the annotator folks are working on, models are effective folk are working on, and other systems to enable innovation against the extensibility without limiting what we're going to provide and what we're going to specify that everyone must support.
So I'm going to share my perspective as the W3C person who's worked in quite a few groups. The Web Apps Working Group, which is one of our big groups, has about 20 deliverables, and each of them is as complex as robust anchoring. And the way that group works is each, the people who are interested in a particular topic focus on that particular topic. And that's why we mention in here the idea of two mailing lists. One mailing list to discuss things, discuss things about, for example, we could have one specific mailing list for robust anchoring. The only reason I can see, honestly, to leave it out, considering that nobody else is working on it, I don't think we can punt on it. I don't think we can punt on it. I don't think we can punt on it. And the only reason I can see to leave it out, or to leave everything else out, is if we're trying to limit the IP scope of the group. And because that's the only pragmatic reason I can see to leave it out, to be honest, because I don't see anybody else working on it. It is necessary to the work of the group, and the group can, if people are interested in working on this, the group can grow to whatever size is needed to address the robust anchoring and the other stuff at the same time. If there is indeed interest in doing it. And just because we put it in the charter, it could be that we get to the point where we've discussed it for a while and we finally decide, no, actually a lot of people have tried to solve this before, and we can't solve it either. So if we get to that point, we can simply say, we're not actually going to deliver this deliverable. But leaving it out seems like we're giving up before we even try to start, in my opinion. Unless somebody is saying, we will join this group, but only if you only work on this or only work on that. That's the only reason I can personally see for leaving it out. That's my personal perspective.
I personally believe point 5 is really important, but it mixes two things. One is the need to have a way to get interoperability in how various systems specify the scope of an annotation within a document object model, and which is a real problem because everybody who has developed an annotation store got with some specific solution for doing that, and some of them are pretty complex or So this could be seen simply as a part of the abstract data model, but since there was so much effort and struggle in producing tentative solution, I believe it deserves to stand as a separate point. Then there is another issue, which is the robustness aspect, and which I think is quite well defined with allowance to some degree, but it leaves really room for maneuver. But it's clear that it's already it would already be important to achieve the first part that I just mentioned. That is, we have a preferred way, or I'm not sure the expression an algorithm is the best chosen one to describe what is there. The algorithm applies more to the question of robustness. How do you, while if you think about simply having an interoperable link anchoring, that would be simply a data model. And I mean, I remember from my very old studies that both are equivalent, but
I would suggest just keep that, just implicitly making it as part of the data model ties it too closely specifically to annotation, whereas I think that it is a bigger item that applies more broadly, and so that's why we called it out as a specific item, because it is applicable to lots of different technologies, not just annotation.
I just wanted to data structure that is stored, and there's the algorithm that finds the thing. And the algorithms might change over time, but the data structure has to be, I mean, we have to define what is stored so that future algorithms can maybe link in a better way.
I would suggest that actually both storage and what we decide is important to store and how we decide to apply the algorithm both might change. But that's okay, because web standards can change too.
Okay.
This is not forever immutable, right?
I was just going to say that there seems to be a rumbling of people just taking issue with the explicit mention of algorithms here, and maybe it's time to just propose a way to address this and have a discussion on it.
Yeah. So how about we say something along the lines of a mechanism to determine a selected passage of text or portion of media that may serve as the target of the annotation in a predictable and interoperable manner, with allowance for some degree of document changes and with an extensible mechanism for other types of media.
So if I had annotation in Safari, then...
Sorry.
No.
I wanted to give him a chance to describe that.
I don't want to add, it's just...
Okay.
I think what you propose is to put, instead of that,
a mechanism.
As I said, if I had annotation in Safari,
okay, so let me, so in other words, replace this with mechanism, replace this, remove within an HTML5 DOM.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And add at the end and an extensible mechanism for adding other media, other media types.
Okay.
Yes, no?
Yes.
Summarize that?
Yes, okay. The resolution, we will change robust link anchoring to a mechanism to determine a selected passage of text or portion of media that may serve as the target for the annotation in a predictable and interoperable manner, with allowance for some degree of document changes and an extensible mechanism to allow other media types.
And there will be some words missing.
But that's not the final wording. We'll keep massaging.
So instead of removing completely HTML5 DOM, could we make it maybe optional, like at least HTML5 DOM, or like at least mention it in some?
I hear what you're saying, but I heard other people saying that they wanted to make it more about the idea. I just rather assume that that's.
But like you could say at least an HTML5 DOM. That would be amazing.
If one of the outcomes of this is the working together with the EPUB group, and this has to be there, and it's an HTML5 DOM in EPUB, so it has to be there.
How about including but not limited to HTML5?
Yeah.
As the very last part of that sentence, because that's one of the types of media.